we moved on to building system number 2 while still keeping system number 1 in the field and maintaining it. System number 2 was another PDP-11, just like the first one, except I got Ted Panofsky to agree to design and build a more sophisticated display processor. Ted worked at the AI lab. Did you hire him?
Yes, I did.
He worked at the AI lab and maintained all of the computers there. And so Ted designed the display processor, and Hugh designed, there were a number of things we're doing. Number one, we were really gearing up for production, so we needed fiberglass cases. And so Hugh designed the cases that they're in today, which I've always thought was a really nice design. He did the design, then that design goes over to a pattern shop, and they build a full-size pattern, mock-up. Then you go over to the fiberglass shop, and they build a mold off of the pattern. And then once they have the mold, then they can actually make the cases. So,
I know that they survived quite well. The cases have survived quite well.
They sure have, and they took quite a beating over beyond the life of Galaxy game, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But building the pattern, the mold, and the cases, that must have been $6,000 to $8,000 back in 1971 dollars. And the joysticks that we really was the thing that we had the most problem with. Hugh found a good machine shop, and they took the joysticks. Oh, by the way, the joysticks that we had back in '71, if you wanted to build a video game, you wanted joysticks. You couldn't just go anywhere like you can today and buy a joystick. There were none anywhere. There were two places that were surplus stores for electronic equipment. One was J&H Outlet on Industrial Boulevard in San Carlos, and the other was Mike Quinn's up at the airport.
Famous for this organization.
Yeah, complete junk. You go in there, there's electronic junk scattered all over the place. And so I was scouring those places, and I came across these joysticks that came out of a B-52, and they weren't for flying the plane. They were to control the navigation stuff somewhere in the back. And in fact, there is a scene in Dr. Strangelove when the bomb goes off in front of the B-52, and there's fire and all in the navigator compartment, and James Earl Jones is fighting the fire and everything. There's one scene where it flashes through, and I'm sure I see the joystick mounted there.
Well, that wasn't a real B-52. That was a set.
Well, they must have been shopping at J&H Outlet. So, anyway, these joysticks that were sent to a machine shop, they got chopped down, and all of the electronics, and they were fairly sophisticated electronics inside, a whole bunch of potentiometers and stuff, and we didn't want that. All we wanted was micro switches that were on or off. But version 2 was with the machine shop just cutting down and engineering all of the parts that we needed to build really reliable joysticks. So version 2 joysticks were extremely reliable. They almost never fail now. And in fact, all of the second generation system was very reliable. So we started that in March of '72, and it was ready for installation at Stanford in September of '72. And that system, it was also much more sophisticated in that it had more options. You could have negative gravity, positive gravity, change the size of the gravity, a whole bunch of kind of nice little features. That machine was very popular. It stayed in the coffee house for 8 years. It was very popular. Students had their own, had developed their own style of play, which was, and this was the young guys, of course, would come in on Friday and Saturday nights in particular, and there would be a crowd of people around the machine, and what you do is take your quarter and you'd stick it in this line of quarters on top of the machine, and that was your placeholder. And when it got to be your turn, you put in the quarter, that got you 3 games for a quarter, and as long as you were the surviving ship out of 4, and they would link together into a 4-player game, and as long as you were the surviving ship and you still had some fuel left, you got a free game. And so so you put in your quarter, and as long as you could play on that quarter, you got to stay there. But when you ran out of games, you had to go to the back of the line and somebody else came in.
Is that still on the paper tape?
Whenever the program failed, which was not, or the memory failed, and for some reason you had to reload the program, I would have to haul in an ASR 33 teletype that had a paper tape reader on the side, plug it into the machine, and load the paper tape again. But generally that would be every 2 or 3 years. It didn't happen very often.
So the second version was more reliable?
It was very reliable. I was quite pleased with how reliable. And now after number 1, there was a real focus on reliability in building number 2. And now number 2, well anyway, so I won't get ahead of myself. So no, it was very reliable. It ran for 8 years. I take it back, there was one part that was not reliable, which was the display processor. We had used sockets, wire wrap sockets from Texas Instruments. And this was kind of early on in the whole wire wraps and sockets thing. And TI had given us some sockets that didn't make good contact with the leads from the dips. And so sometimes I would, when the display was on the fritz, I would go in there and I would open up the side of the machine, it's still running, and bend the boards until it started to work. And then I'd put shims in there to kind of hold the board in that position.
A very warped form of maintenance.
I did that for quite a while, and finally I decided I had to, there was another fix that came into my mind, and I really didn't want to do it. But I finally decided, I've got to try something. So I went out and got a whole bunch of solder tail sockets, and the leads that would go into the board and be soldered were wider than the leads coming out of the chips themselves. And so I figured if I took the chip out and plugged the solder tail into the TI socket and then plugged the chip back in, I would solve the connector problem by doubling the number of connectors. I know, it didn't feel right, but at some point I got desperate. So I did that. And I don't mean to brag or anything, but I didn't have to warp the boards as much as often.
So, did you tinker? You said you added the extra modes. Did you do any programming after it got, any further tinkering after it got installed?
No. That's it. No, once it was installed, the program was never changed again. There were, in the final stages of testing the machine, before it was installed,